Welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to talk about one of the most exciting and underrated action-adventure movies of 2015. The movie is called Big Game, and if you have not seen it yet, by the end of this video you are going to want to watch it immediately. So let us get into everything you need to know about this film, from where it came from, who made it, what it is about, and all the major details that make this movie worth your time. Overview. Big Game is a 2014 production that was widely released to international audiences in 2015, which is why most people refer to it as a 2015 film. This is a Finnish-British-German-American co-production, which makes it a truly international project. The movie was produced under multiple production companies including Sub-Zero Film Entertainment, Altitude Film Entertainment, Bavaria Film Partners, Headgear Films, Metro Technology, Film House Germany, Egeli Tassel Film GmbH, Ketchup Entertainment, Vision Plus Fund I, and Waterstone Entertainment. The film was distributed by Nordisk Film Distribution in Finland, Entertainment One in the United Kingdom, EuropaCorp in the United States, and Ascot Elite in Germany. The movie was directed and co-written by Finnish filmmaker Jalmari Helander, who also co-wrote the screenplay with Petri Jokeranta. Helander is a Finnish director who was already known in his home country, and Big Game became his biggest international project by far. The fact that this film was made primarily as a Finnish production but featured Hollywood-level talent and an international cast made it a very unique project at the time of its release. The budget of the film was approximately 8.5 million euros, which translates to around $10 million, and at the time of its production, it was considered the most expensive film ever made in Finland. That alone tells you how ambitious this project was for Finnish cinema. The story is set in the wilderness of Finland, specifically in the snowy and remote forests of Finnish Lapland, although the actual outdoor filming was done in the Alps region of Europe, with the remainder of the production taking place in Germany. The film runs for 90 minutes, is rated PG-13, and blends action, adventure, thriller, and coming-of-age elements in a very entertaining and accessible way. Plot details. The story of Big Game begins with a 13-year-old Finnish boy named Oskari Kantoi, played by Ani Tamala. Oskari is a young boy who is about to undertake a very important and traditional rite of passage in his community. According to the tradition of his people, every boy must go alone into the wilderness for 24 hours, armed with only a bow and arrow, and return with a trophy to prove his worth and maturity. This is a deeply meaningful ritual for Oskari, and the pressure on him is even greater because his father, Tapio Kantoi, is a legendary hunter in the community who is known for having hunted and defeated a bear with his bare hands on his own coming-of-age hunt. Oskari is already feeling the weight of his father's legendary reputation, and he doubts whether he can live up to the expectations placed on him. He sets out into the forest alone and follows a map that his father left for him. However, when he discovers the location on the map, he finds a portable refrigeration unit inside which there is a pre-killed deer head, essentially suggesting that his father had arranged a shortcut for him because he did not believe his son was capable of doing it on his own. This discovery completely shatters Oskari's already fragile confidence. At exactly the same time, something extraordinary is happening in the skies above Finland. Air Force One, the presidential aircraft of the United States, is flying over Finnish airspace when it is suddenly attacked and shot down by a group of terrorists. The President of the United States, William Allen Moore, escapes the plane in a special escape pod and parachutes down into the very same forest where Oskari is on his hunt. Oskari witnesses the crash of the pod and discovers the President inside it. This is the moment where the story truly begins. President Moore is disoriented, confused, and completely out of his element. He is a man used to being surrounded by security, advisors, and the most powerful military on Earth, and now he is stranded in a freezing Finnish forest with nothing but the company of a young boy who barely speaks English. The two form an unlikely alliance as they try to survive and find a way to safety. Meanwhile, back at the Pentagon, a team of officials is watching the events unfold through satellite surveillance. This group includes the Vice President of the United States, the Director of the CIA, General Underwood, and a seasoned former CIA operative named Fred Herbert, who has been brought in as a special consultant to help locate and rescue the president. The audience quickly begins to sense that not everything happening at the Pentagon is as it seems, and that some of those in positions of power may not actually want the president to be rescued alive. The main villain on the ground is a man named Morris, played by Ray Stevenson. Morris is a corrupt United States Secret Service agent who was actually stationed on board Air Force One and was the one who orchestrated the entire attack on the plane from the inside. He is working alongside a mercenary named Hazar, played by Mehmet Kurtulus, who was originally a CIA operative but is now operating as a freelance terrorist. Their plan is not simply to kill the president. Instead, they want to capture him like a trophy, treating the hunt for the President of the United States as literally a big game hunt, which is the clever and deeply ironic meaning behind the film's title. Morris had received a bullet wound during the attack that left a fragment of shrapnel dangerously close to his heart, which adds to his desperation and unpredictability as a villain. Hazar and his team close in on Oskari and the president, and in a tense sequence, they manage to capture President Moore and seal him inside the refrigeration unit. Their plan is to take him away by helicopter and kill him later in a staged and humiliating manner. However, Oskari, who has been regaining his confidence throughout the story thanks to the president's encouragement, refuses to give up. He leaps onto the refrigeration unit just as the helicopter begins to carry it away. Oskari drops the unit into a river, and from there the story builds toward its climax. The president and Oskari discover that the river leads directly to the lake where Air Force One originally crashed. They swim into the wreckage of the plane to hide and wait for rescue. Hazar follows them inside the plane, sets a time bomb, and receives new orders to simply kill the president rather than capture him for the elaborate execution plan. In a moment of genuine tension, President Moore manages to kill Hazar before he and Oskari make their escape from the rapidly flooding and exploding aircraft using the ejector seats from the plane. As they launch into the air, Morris appears in a helicopter and leans out to shoot them. Oskari fires an arrow at Morris, which strikes him in the chest. Although the arrow does not penetrate Morris's protective body armor, the force of the impact drives the shrapnel fragment directly into Morris's heart, killing him. Morris falls from the helicopter just as Air Force One itself explodes in a massive fireball, destroying the helicopter as well and sending the president and Oskari flying through the air all the way back to the forest camp where Oskari's hunting mission had originally begun. At the camp, a Navy SEAL team simultaneously arrives to locate and secure the president. The final moments of the story are genuinely heartwarming. President Moore speaks directly with Oskari's father, Tapio, and tells him with complete sincerity that his son is the bravest man he has ever met in his life. Oskari, the boy who started the story doubting himself entirely and believing he would never be as great as his father, ends the story having saved the life of the most powerful man on Earth. As a final honor, Oskari is awarded the Medal of Honor for his extraordinary bravery. In a separate final scene set at the Pentagon, the Vice President and Fred Herbert have a private conversation in which it is revealed that the entire attack on Air Force One was part of a political conspiracy. Hazar had originally been a CIA operative, and the plan had been designed to have the president killed so that the vice president could take power and use the tragedy to launch a new war on terror. Because the president survived, the vice president's plan has completely failed, and Moore is now being celebrated as a national hero. To ensure that no evidence of the conspiracy can ever be traced back to him, Herbert calmly kills the vice president, leaving all the loose ends permanently buried. Cast. The cast of Big Game is one of its strongest elements and brings a level of credibility and star power to what is essentially a Finnish action film. Samuel L. Jackson plays President William Allen Moore. Jackson is one of the most recognizable and prolific actors in Hollywood, known for dozens of major films, and his presence in this movie gave it immediate international attention. Ani Tamala plays Oskari Kante, the young Finnish boy at the heart of the story. Tamala delivers a very grounded and convincing performance as a child carrying enormous pressure and self-doubt. Ray Stevenson plays the primary villain Morris, the corrupt Secret Service agent. Stevenson is a British actor with significant experience in action films, and his physical presence makes Morris a genuinely threatening antagonist. Victor Garber plays the Vice President of the United States. Mehmet Kurtulus plays Hazar, the mercenary and former CIA operative who serves as the main physical threat to the president on the ground. Ted Levine plays General Underwood. Felicity Huffman plays the director of the CIA. Jim Broadbent plays Fred Herbert, the veteran former CIA operative brought in as a special consultant at the Pentagon. Jorma Tamala, who is the real-life father of Ani Tamala, plays Tapio Kantu, Oskari's father in the film, which adds a beautiful and genuine layer of warmth to that particular relationship. The supporting cast also includes Risto Salmi as Hamara, Rano Juvonen as the safari pilot, and James Butler as Otis. Release date: Big Game had its world premiere at the Toronto International Film Festival on September 5, 2014. It was then released theatrically in Finland on March 19, 2015, where it opened at number 4 at the box office and performed well for a domestic Finnish film. The film had its North American release on June 26, 2015, which was a limited theatrical release, meaning it was shown only in select cinemas across major markets rather than receiving a wide nationwide rollout. The DVD and Blu-ray release followed on August 25, 2015, and the film was made available on major digital platforms simultaneously with its theatrical release in June 2015, including services like Amazon Video, iTunes, Google Play, Apple, and Vudu. Trailer info. The trailer for Big Game was released ahead of its 2015 wide release and immediately caught the attention of action movie fans worldwide due to the striking visual contrast between Samuel L. Jackson as the President of the United States and a small Finnish boy running through a snow-covered wilderness with a bow and arrow. The trailer highlighted the survival action sequences, the explosive destruction of Air Force One, and the central dynamic between the President and Oskari. It presented the film as a fun, fast-paced adventure with a healthy dose of spectacle and humor, which is exactly what the movie delivers. Big Game is a genuinely fun and well-crafted film that deserves far more attention than it received on its original release. It combines a high-concept Hollywood premise with the unique aesthetic and storytelling sensibility of Finnish cinema, and the result is something that feels genuinely fresh and different from the usual action blockbuster. If you enjoy survival thrillers, coming-of-age stories, and the kind of bold action-adventure films that defined the 1980s and 1990s, then Big Game is absolutely the movie for you. The story of Big Game begins in the heart of the Finnish wilderness, deep within the ancient and unforgiving forests of the north. The landscape is vast, cold, and beautiful, stretching endlessly in every direction with towering trees, frozen rivers, and mountains draped in snow and mist. It is a place that demands respect, survival instinct, and courage from anyone who enters it. This is the world into which a 13-year-old boy named Oskari Kante is about to step entirely alone, armed with nothing but a bow, a quiver of arrows, and the crushing weight of his family's legendary reputation. Oskari is not a particularly large or physically imposing boy. He is quiet, thoughtful, and deeply sensitive, traits that are not exactly celebrated in a community built around the traditions of hunting and physical strength. His father, Tapio Kantu, is a man of almost mythological status in their village. Tapio is known as one of the greatest hunters the community has ever produced, a man who on his own coming-of-age hunt decades earlier went into the forest alone, and came back having defeated a bear with his own hands. That story has become legend, and every person in the village knows it. The problem for Oskari is that he has grown up inside that legend, and every day of his young life has been lived in the shadow of a father whose achievements feel impossible to match. The tradition of their people dictates that when a boy reaches the age of 13, he must go alone into the wilderness for 24 hours, armed only with a bow and arrow, and return with a trophy that proves his worth. It is a rite of passage, a test of character and survival, and a bridge between boyhood and manhood. For most boys it is already a serious challenge. For Oskari, the son of the great Tapio, the expectations are almost impossibly high. The entire village gathers on the morning of his departure, and you can see in the faces of the people there a quiet uncertainty, a sense that perhaps this particular boy does not quite have what it takes. Oskari himself can feel their doubt, and more painfully, he shares it. His father sends him off with a map. Tapio tells Oskari to follow the map, and it will lead him to where he needs to go. Oskari takes this as a sign of his father's faith in him, a guiding hand pointing him toward his destiny. He sets off into the forest with his bow on his back and the map in his hand, walking deeper and deeper into the trees as the sounds of the village fade away behind him. He is completely alone for the first time in his life, and the forest immediately makes him feel small. Every sound, every shadow, every creak of a branch reminds him that out here, no one is coming to help him. As Oskari makes his way through the wilderness, following the path on his father's map, the story shifts dramatically to the skies above Finland. High in the atmosphere, Air Force One, the official aircraft of the President of the United States, is cutting through the night on a routine international flight. On board is President William Allen Moore, played with easy charisma by Samuel L. Jackson. President Moore is a man who, by his own admission, has grown somewhat comfortable in the bubble of the presidency. He is surrounded at all times by layers of protection, by Secret Service agents, by advisors, by protocols and systems designed to keep him safe from every possible threat in the world. He is powerful, composed, and accustomed to the world bending around him rather than the other way around. Among the Secret Service detail on board Air Force One is a man named Morris. Morris is played by Ray Stevenson, and from the very beginning there is something cold and calculating behind his eyes. He is professional and efficient in his duties, but the audience quickly begins to sense that something is deeply wrong with him. What the president does not know, what none of the crew on board know, is that Morris has been secretly working against the president for some time. Morris has aligned himself with a plan, a conspiracy orchestrated from within the highest levels of American power, to have the president eliminated. The purpose of the assassination is political. Certain figures in the American government, led behind the scenes by the vice president, have determined that the death of the president in a spectacular terrorist attack would serve their ambitions perfectly. It would allow the vice president to assume the presidency, and use the tragedy as justification for launching a new and expansive war on terror. Morris's partner in this conspiracy is a man named Hazar, played with chilling menace by Mehmet Kurtulus. Hazar is a former CIA operative who has gone rogue, operating now as a mercenary and freelance terrorist for hire. He is experienced, ruthless, and completely without conscience when it comes to completing a mission. Hazar and his team are waiting in the darkness below, ready to execute their part of the plan the moment Morris gives them what they need. From inside Air Force One, Morris provides the critical information and window of vulnerability that Hazar needs. The attack on the presidential aircraft is sudden, violent, and devastatingly effective. Air Force One is struck, systems fail, and chaos erupts on board. In the confusion, Morris sustains a bullet wound, but the injury is not fatal in the conventional sense. The bullet leaves a fragment of shrapnel lodged dangerously close to his heart, a ticking clock inside his own body that adds an undercurrent of desperation to everything he does from that point forward. President Moore is rushed to an escape pod by what remains of the Secret Service detail, and the pod is jettisoned from the stricken aircraft. Air Force One, the most famous and powerful plane in the world, spirals downward and crashes into a lake in the Finnish wilderness far below. The escape pod carrying President Moore shoots through the sky and crashes down hard into the same vast forest where Oskari is making his solitary way through the night. The impact is enormous, shaking the trees and lighting up the darkness. Oskari hears the crash and sees the fire and smoke, and despite every instinct telling him to stay away from something so clearly dangerous and unknown, his curiosity and the basic human impulse to help draws him toward it. He makes his way carefully through the trees and finds the pod in a small clearing, battered and smoking but intact. When he manages to get the pod open, he finds inside it a middle-aged man in a suit, dazed and bruised but alive. The President of the United States and the 13-year-old Finnish boy stare at each other across a gulf of language, culture, age, and experience that could not possibly be wider. Moore does not speak Finnish. Oskari speaks only very limited English. Neither of them fully understands who the other is at first, and neither of them has any idea what to do next. It is one of the most genuinely charming and unusual setups in any action film of its era, and the chemistry between the two actors makes it work beautifully. Meanwhile, back at the Pentagon in Washington, the loss of Air Force One has triggered a full emergency response. The Vice President, played by Victor Garber, takes his position at the head of the crisis team with a gravity and urgency that appears convincing. Alongside him are the Director of the CIA, played by Felicity Huffman, and General Underwood, played by Ted Levine. The team is tracking the situation through satellite feeds and intelligence reports, trying to piece together what happened and where the President is. Into this situation walks Fred Herbert, played by a wonderfully sardonic Jim Broadbent. Herbert is a veteran former CIA field operative who has been brought in as a special consultant because of his deep experience with exactly this kind of crisis. He carries himself with the quiet confidence of a man who has seen everything and is surprised by nothing, and his presence adds a layer of dry, world-weary intelligence to the scenes at the Pentagon. What the audience begins to understand, even as the crisis team appears to be working urgently on the President's behalf, is that the Vice President and Herbert are not actually what they seem. They are the architects of the conspiracy. They are the ones who set this entire chain of events in motion. The satellite surveillance that is supposed to be tracking the President's location is actually being used to feed information to Morris and Hazar on the ground, helping them close in on the President before any genuine rescue can reach him. Back in the forest, Moore and Oskari begin to move. The President quickly grasps that remaining near the crash site is dangerous, and Oskari, whatever his limitations as a hunter might be, knows the forest better than anyone. The two of them begin to navigate the wilderness together, and in this process their relationship begins to develop in ways that neither of them expected. Moore sees in Oskari a seriousness and a quiet resilience that he respects, even as he also sees the crushing self-doubt the boy carries. Oskari, for his part, begins to realize that this powerful man from the outside world is not so different from him in one key way. Moore, for all his power and authority, is a man who has spent his presidency feeling somewhat passive, somewhat managed, somewhat less than the forceful leader he believes the role demands. In the wilderness, stripped of all his power and protection, he is just a man trying to survive, and in that honesty there is a kind of freedom. There is a moment of genuine vulnerability when Oskari finally reaches the location his father's map pointed him toward and discovers the refrigeration unit with the pre-killed deer head inside it. This is the crushing revelation that his father did not truly believe in him. Tapio had arranged for his son to find a pre-prepared trophy so that he could return to the village without shame, a kindness that is also, in its deepest sense, a declaration of doubt. Oskari is devastated. He sits in the cold silence of the forest with this knowledge, and for a moment, he seems ready to give up entirely. It is President Moore who pulls him back. Moore, a man who understands what it means to be underestimated, who knows how it feels to have other people arrange your success because they do not believe you can achieve it yourself, speaks to Oskari with a directness and sincerity that cuts through the language barrier. He tells the boy that what matters is not the trophy, not what his father or his village expects, but what Oskari himself chooses to do right now, in this moment, when everything is hard and no one is watching. It is the kind of conversation that changes a person, and you can see it changing Oskari in real time. The respite does not last long. Morris and Hazar and their team of mercenaries have been tracking the president's movements through the forest, and they close in with brutal efficiency. In a tense and violent confrontation, the mercenaries overwhelmed the president and Oskari. Hazar and his team managed to capture President Moore and seal him inside the very refrigeration unit that had so demoralized Oskari just moments earlier. Their plan is to load the unit into a helicopter and transport the president to a location where they can carry out their elaborate and humiliating execution at leisure, treating the leader of the free world as a literal hunting trophy, the ultimate big game prize. It is a deeply sinister and strangely theatrical form of cruelty, and it speaks to Hazar's particular brand of operatic evil. The helicopter begins to rise with the unit suspended below it. Morris stands nearby, injured and desperate, watching the plan he has worked so long to execute finally come to its completion. And then something happens that no one anticipated. Oskari, who has been watching everything from the trees, makes a decision. The boy who doubted himself entirely, who believed he was not capable of being what his community needed him to be, who sat in the snow with a dead deer's head and nearly gave up on everything, decides that he is not going to let this happen. He runs from the tree line, leaps through the air, and grabs onto the refrigeration unit just as the helicopter begins to carry it away from the ground. Hanging on with everything he has, Oskari manages to guide and eventually force the refrigeration unit into a river below, dropping it from enough height that the impact breaks it open and releases the president into the freezing water. The two of them surface, gasping and alive, and push through the river current together. Following the flow of the water, they realize that this particular river leads directly to the lake where Air Force One originally came down after being struck. The crashed wreckage of the aircraft rests underwater, enormous and eerily silent, and Moore and Oskari make the decision to swim down into it and use it as a hiding place while they wait for a rescue team to reach them. Inside the submerged wreckage of Air Force One, the tension reaches its peak. Hazar is not finished. He tracks them into the aircraft, moving through the flooded corridors with a hunter's patience and focus. He finds them, and in the confined and dangerous environment of the sinking plane, he sets a time bomb to destroy the entire wreckage and everyone inside it. His orders have shifted from capturing the president for theatrical execution to simply killing him as quickly and cleanly as possible, because the situation is now too complicated for anything else. The confrontation inside Air Force One is claustrophobic and intense, with water rising around them and the clock on Hazar's bomb ticking down. In a final desperate struggle, President Moore manages to overpower and kill Hazar. It is a significant moment for Moore's character, because throughout the entire film he has been the one being protected and carried by others, and here, in this last moment, he acts. Moore and Oskari make their escape from the plane using the ejector seats from the aircraft's cockpit, launching themselves up through the water and into the sky above the lake just as the bomb detonates, and Air Force One explodes in a catastrophic fireball beneath them. The explosion sends shockwaves through the air and the water, and the two of them are blasted upward and outward through the sky in a moment that is genuinely spectacular, and not entirely disconnected from reality in the cheerful way of the best action films. As they fly through the air, Morris makes his final appearance, leaning out of a hovering helicopter with a weapon aimed at the president and Oskari. This is his last chance to complete the mission he has sacrificed everything for, to drive that shrapnel fragment into the president's name in the history books. Oskari, sailing through the air with his bow somehow still in his hand, draws back and releases an arrow at Morris. The arrow strikes him square in the chest. It does not penetrate his body armor. By every conventional measure, it should not have worked. But the force of the arrow's impact at that precise location drives the shrapnel fragment that has been sitting near Morris's heart since the attack on Air Force One directly into that organ, and Morris dies instantly. He falls from the helicopter and plunges downward just as the explosion from Air Force One reaches the helicopter and destroys it completely. Moore and Oskari land together back at the forest camp where Oskari's hunting journey first began, which feels both absurd and deeply satisfying in the way that only the best adventure stories can manage. A Navy SEAL team arrives at exactly the same moment to locate and secure the president, finding him standing in the snow with a 13-year-old Finnish boy who is trying to catch his breath after the most extraordinary 24 hours of his life. The emotional resolution of the film is handled with genuine warmth. President Moore speaks to Oskari's father, Tapio, and tells him directly, looking the legendary hunter in the eye, that his son is without question the bravest man he has ever met. For Oskari, who began this journey believing that bravery was something he simply did not possess, it is the most important thing anyone has ever said to him. Tapio, a man who doubted his own son enough to prearrange his trophy, hears the words of the most powerful man in the world and understands what his son has actually done. Oskari is later awarded the Medal of Honor by the United States government for saving the president's life, and the boy who could not draw his bow stands before the world having earned something his father's trophy could never have given him. In a final scene at the Pentagon, the last piece of the conspiracy is resolved in the quietest and most chilling way possible. The vice president and Herbert are alone in a private room, discussing the failure of their plan. The president survived, and rather than dying as a casualty of a terrorist attack, he has become a hero. The vice president has lost his chance at the presidency, and worse, the conspiracy itself is in danger of being uncovered. Herbert, the old CIA operative who has spent his career making problems disappear, solves this final problem the way he has solved all the others. He kills the vice president in that private room, eliminating the last loose thread and ensuring that nothing can ever be traced back to either of them. It is a cold, quiet ending to the political storyline, and it leaves the audience with the understanding that in the world of power and politics, the most dangerous people are often the ones standing closest to those at the top. Big Game is ultimately a story about what it means to be brave when no one has prepared you for it, when the situation demands more than you believe you have, and when the only choice left is to act anyway. Oskari does not become a hero because he was trained for it or born into it. He becomes a hero because in the moment that mattered, he decided to be one. That is the heart of the film, and it is why the story, for all its action and spectacle and explosive set pieces, leaves you feeling genuinely moved at the end. Here is the complete and lengthy life history of every main actor from Big Game, 2015. Samuel L. Jackson. Samuel Leroy Jackson was born on December 21, 1948, in Washington, D.C., and was raised in Chattanooga, Tennessee, by his mother and maternal grandparents. His father, Roy Henry Jackson, was largely absent from his life, and Samuel grew up in a household where his mother, Elizabeth, worked in a factory and later as a domestic worker to provide for the family. Growing up in the deeply segregated American South during the 1950s and 1960s was a formative experience for Jackson in every possible way. He witnessed racial inequality and social injustice firsthand from a very young age, and those experiences shaped his worldview, his sense of purpose, and eventually the intensity and passion he would bring to his work as an actor for decades to come. As a child, Jackson suffered from a significant stutter, which made communication extremely difficult and often embarrassing for him. He was a quiet and somewhat introverted boy as a result, and the stutter caused him real pain in social situations. One of the ways he discovered he could control and manage the stutter was through reading aloud, and this discovery of the power of spoken language would eventually lead him directly toward performance. He attended public schools in Chattanooga and was by all accounts a bright and curious student who absorbed information quickly. He was deeply moved by the civil rights movement happening around him and became increasingly politically conscious as he entered his teenage years. Jackson enrolled at Morehouse College in Atlanta, Georgia, in 1966, originally intending to study marine biology. However, the world of theater captured him almost immediately after he arrived on campus, and he made the decision to change his focus to drama. Morehouse was a historically black college with a rich intellectual and cultural tradition, and being surrounded by other young black men who were serious about ideas, art, and justice had a profound effect on Jackson. He threw himself into acting, performing in college productions and discovering that the stage was a place where his stutter disappeared entirely, where he could inhabit characters with a freedom and confidence that he struggled to find in ordinary life. His years at Morehouse were also marked by significant political activism. In 1969, Jackson and a group of fellow students took several members of the Morehouse Board of Trustees hostage as part of a protest demanding changes to the college curriculum and greater representation on the board. The board members that were held captive included Martin Luther King Sr., the father of the assassinated civil rights leader. The incident resulted in Jackson being suspended from Morehouse for 2 years, and the FBI subsequently opened a file on him. During his suspension, he traveled to Los Angeles and worked briefly before returning to Morehouse and completing his degree in drama in 1972. After graduating, Jackson moved to New York City and immersed himself in the theater community. He worked extensively with the Negro Ensemble Company and performed in numerous stage productions throughout the 1970s. These were lean years financially, and Jackson took whatever work he could find, including jobs outside of acting to pay the bills. He appeared in small roles in films and television during this period, slowly building a foundation of experience even if recognition was slow in coming. He worked with directors and actors who were serious about their craft, and the discipline and rigor of the New York theater world gave him a technical foundation that would serve him for the rest of his life. The 1980s brought serious personal challenges for Jackson. He developed a severe addiction to crack cocaine, which at its worst point nearly destroyed everything he had built. His family, including his wife LaTanya Richardson, whom he had married in 1980, and their daughter Zoe, born in 1982, bore the weight of this period alongside him. Jackson has spoken publicly and honestly about how bad things got during those years, and how close he came to losing not just his career but his life. It was ultimately an intervention staged by his wife and his mother that forced him to confront the addiction directly. He entered a rehabilitation program and committed fully to sobriety, and the transformation in his life and career following his recovery was remarkable. In the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, Jackson began to gain serious attention in the film world. His early collaboration with director Spike Lee, including roles in films like School Days and Do the Right Thing, established him as a performer of genuine power and presence. He was not yet a household name, but within the industry he was becoming known as one of the most compelling supporting actors working in American cinema. His performance in Jungle Fever in 1991, playing a crack-addicted character, earned him the first ever Best Supporting Performance prize at the Cannes Film Festival and announced to the world that Samuel L. Jackson was operating at an entirely different level. The role that changed everything came in 1994, when director Quentin Tarantino cast him as Jules Winfield in Pulp Fiction. The film was an immediate cultural phenomenon, and Jackson's performance, as the philosophical hitman who quotes scripture before carrying out executions, became one of the most iconic in cinema history. His delivery of Ezekiel 25 verse 17 became something people memorized and recited, and the character of Jules was so fully realized, so electrifying and strange and deeply human, that it earned Jackson an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor and made him a genuine movie star overnight. He was 45 years old when Pulp Fiction was released, a reminder that some careers take their time finding their proper shape. From that point forward, Jackson became one of the most consistently working and recognizable actors in the world. He starred in Die Hard with a Vengeance alongside Bruce Willis, played a leading role in A Time to Kill based on John Grisham's novel, starred in The Long Kiss Goodnight, and appeared in a remarkable range of films across every genre. He joined the Star Wars universe as Mace Windu in the prequel trilogy beginning with The Phantom Menace in 1999, a role he specifically requested from George Lucas and one that introduced him to an entirely new generation of fans worldwide. He appeared in the Marvel Cinematic Universe as Nick Fury beginning with a now legendary post-credits scene in Iron Man in 2008, a role he would continue to play across numerous films and television productions for well over a decade. Throughout all of this, Jackson maintained a work ethic and output that was genuinely extraordinary. He became famous for appearing in a very large number of films, embracing the idea that he loved working and saw no reason to be selective in a way that would leave him sitting at home. He worked with virtually every major director of his generation, from Steven Spielberg to Catherine Bigelow to Martin Scorsese to the Coen brothers, and he brought the same commitment and intensity to every role regardless of the film's scale or budget. He appeared in Jackie Brown, Unbreakable, Changing Lanes, Coach Carter, Snakes on a Plane, Inglourious Bastard, Django Unchained, The Hateful Eight, and countless others. Jackson received an honorary Academy Award in 2022, the Academy's Governor's Award, recognizing his extraordinary career and contribution to cinema. He is widely considered one of the most important and influential screen actors of his generation, and his cultural footprint is almost impossible to overstate. Ani Tamala. Ani Tamala was born on August 5, 2000, in Finland, and he comes from a family with deep roots in Finnish cinema and theater. His father, Jorma Tamala, is a well-established and highly respected Finnish actor who has worked across film, television, and theater throughout his career, and the two of them share one of the most genuinely touching connections in Big Game, playing father and son in the film in addition to being father and son in real life. Growing up in a household where acting was a serious profession gave Ani an unusual and valuable perspective on the craft from his earliest years. Ani began acting at a very young age, and his introduction to serious film work came through director Jalmari Helander, who cast him in the Finnish film Rare Exports, A Christmas Tale in 2010, when Ani was just around 9 or 10 years old. Rare Exports is a darkly comic and genuinely frightening Finnish Christmas horror film that reimagines Santa Claus as a terrifying ancient creature, and Ani plays the young protagonist Pietari, a boy who discovers the truth about this creature and must find a way to protect his community from it. The performance was remarkable for a child of that age. Ani brought a naturalness and emotional depth to the role that announced him as a genuinely gifted young performer, and the film became an international cult hit, bringing Ani attention well beyond Finland's borders. The working relationship between Ani and director Helander that was established on Rare Exports proved to be a lasting one, and when Helander developed the concept for Big Game, casting Ani in the central role of Oskari was a natural decision. Ani was a teenager by the time production began, and his physical presence had grown alongside his acting ability. The role of Oskari required him not only to act convincingly in emotionally complex scenes alongside one of Hollywood's biggest stars but also to handle demanding physical sequences in genuinely difficult outdoor conditions, running through forests, and climbing and moving with the convincing athleticism of a boy who actually belongs in that landscape. His scenes with Samuel L. Jackson are the emotional core of the film, and what makes them work is the complete absence of self-consciousness in Ani's performance. He does not play Oskari as a movie kid trying to match a movie star. He plays him as a real boy navigating a completely insane situation with the limited resources of a 13-year-old, and that honesty makes every moment between them feel genuine. The relationship between the characters works because the relationship between the actors clearly works, and there is a warmth and an ease in their scenes together that speaks to how well they connected during production. Ani has continued to work in Finnish film and television following Big Game, and is considered one of the more promising young talents to come out of Finnish cinema, in recent years. His career represents a genuinely interesting case of a child performer who transitioned into young adult work without losing the essential quality that made him compelling in the first place. Ray Stevenson. Ray Stevenson was born on May 25, 1964, in Lisburn, Northern Ireland, to a British Royal Air Force pilot father and an Irish mother. His early childhood was shaped by constant movement, as the nature of his father's military career meant that the family relocated frequently, living in various parts of the United Kingdom and elsewhere as postings required. This nomadic early life gave Stevenson a certain adaptability and comfort with different environments and people, qualities that would serve him well as an actor working across vastly different productions and cultures throughout his career. Stevenson grew up in England and attended school there, developing an interest in acting during his teenage years. He trained at the Bristol Old Vic Theatre School, one of the most prestigious and rigorous drama training programs in Britain, and the foundation he received there in classical acting technique gave him a versatility and seriousness of approach that ran through everything he did afterward. Training at a school with such a strong emphasis on voice, movement, and classical text meant that Stevenson arrived in the professional world with tools that went far beyond the surface. He could carry a stage, command a room with physical presence alone, and find the interior life of a character rather than simply presenting its exterior. His early career was built primarily in British theatre and television, and he worked steadily through the 1990s in a range of productions that built his craft and his reputation without yet delivering the kind of breakthrough that would make him a household name. He was a journeyman actor in the best sense of the word during these years, serious about the work, consistent in his output, and respected by the people he worked with even if the wider public had not yet discovered him. The role that first brought Stevenson to major international attention was the lead in the HBO and BBC television series Rome, which aired from 2005 to 2007. In Rome, Stevenson played Titus Pullo, a Roman legionary soldier whose story runs alongside that of his companion Lucius Vorenus through some of the most turbulent and dramatic decades of the late Roman Republic. Pullo is a character of enormous physical and emotional range, a man capable of extraordinary violence and genuine tenderness in almost equal measure, and Stevenson's portrayal was widely praised as one of the finest performances in a series that was itself regarded as one of the most ambitious television productions of its era. The role established him definitively as a serious actor with the ability to carry a major production, and the opportunities that followed reflected that. In 2008, Stevenson took on the title role in Punisher: Warzone, a Marvel Comics adaptation in which he played Frank Castle, the vigilante antihero known as the Punisher. The film was dark and extremely violent, not a critical success but a production that demonstrated Stevenson's willingness to commit completely to a physical and psychologically demanding role. He subsequently joined the Thor franchise as the Asgardian warrior Volstagg, appearing in Thor: The Dark World, and Thor: Ragnarok alongside Chris Hemsworth and a distinguished ensemble cast. His warmth and physical presence made Volstagg one of the more beloved characters in The Warriors 3, and his appearances in those films gave him a connection to the Marvel Universe that ran in parallel with his other work. Stevenson appeared in numerous other significant productions throughout his career, including the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, the Divergent series, and the television series Dexter: New Blood, in which he played a compelling villain in the revival of the long-running crime drama. He worked consistently across film and television on both sides of the Atlantic, and his range was genuinely impressive, moving between historical epics, superhero films, action thrillers, and dramatic television with equal conviction. Tragically, Ray Stevenson passed away on May 21, 2023, at the age of 58, while he was in Italy. His death was felt deeply across the entertainment industry and among the many fans whose lives his performances had touched over nearly 3 decades of work. He is remembered as an actor of great ability, great warmth, and great dedication to his craft. Victor Garber. Victor Garber was born on March 16, 1949, in London, Ontario, Canada, and grew up in a household where the arts were taken seriously and creativity was encouraged. He developed an early passion for performance and began pursuing acting and singing from a young age, quickly demonstrating a natural talent that set him apart from his peers. He studied at the University of Toronto and developed his skills in both the dramatic and musical theatre traditions, building a foundation that would serve him in an extraordinarily varied career that spanned stage, film, and television across more than 5 decades. Garber's theatrical career is remarkable in its breadth and distinction. He has appeared on Broadway in numerous celebrated productions and is particularly associated with the golden era of the Broadway musical. He originated the role of Jesus in the original Toronto production of Godspell in 1972 and subsequently performed the role on Broadway, a performance that brought him to wide attention in the North American theater world. He appeared in Stephen Sondheim's Demi-Monde and various other major stage productions, and his ability to move between the demands of the musical stage and the more intimate requirements of straight dramatic acting marked him as a performer of unusual versatility. His film work brought him a level of recognition that extended well beyond the theater world. He appeared in Titanic in 1997 as Thomas Andrews, the ship's architect and designer, in a role that, while not large, was deeply felt and memorably rendered. The moment when Andrews, surrounded by the chaos of the sinking ship, adjusts the hands of a clock in the first-class smoking room and quietly accepts his fate is one of the more quietly devastating moments in a film full of spectacular destruction, and it speaks to Garber's ability to find enormous emotional weight in very limited screen time. He appeared as the villain Arvin Sloane in the television series Alias, created by J.J. Abrams and starring Jennifer Garner, which ran from 2001 to 2006. Sloane is a character of genuine complexity, a man whose motivations and moral alignments shift across the series in ways that kept audiences constantly uncertain about where his ultimate loyalties lay, and Garber played this ambiguity with great skill, earning several award nominations and widespread critical praise for the performance. He subsequently starred in the superhero drama series The Flash as Martin Stein, one half of the character Firestorm, a role he played from 2014 through 2017 and reprised in the spin-off series Legends of Tomorrow, becoming deeply beloved by a new generation of fans through the DC television universe. Garber has been open about his personal life, coming out publicly as gay in 2012 after years of simply not addressing the question directly in public. He married his longtime partner Rainer Andreessen in 2015, and his openness about his identity has made him an important and respected figure within the LGBTQ community, as well as in the broader entertainment world. Felicity Huffman. Felicity Huffman was born on December 9, 1962, in Bedford, New York, and grew up in a family that valued education and intellectual life. She pursued her interest in acting seriously from a young age and went on to study at the prestigious Juilliard School in New York City, one of the most demanding and respected performing arts conservatories in the world. Training at Juilliard gave her an exceptionally rigorous technical foundation, and the discipline and depth of focus required by that program shaped her approach to acting in fundamental ways that remained visible throughout her career. Following her training, Huffman established herself first in the theater world and then moved into film and television as her career developed. She is perhaps most widely known to mainstream audiences for her role as Lynette Skevo in the ABC television drama Desperate Housewives, which premiered in 2004 and ran for 8 seasons through 2012. The show was a massive hit both critically and commercially, and Huffman's portrayal of Lynette, a former career woman struggling with the demands of motherhood and marriage in a seemingly perfect suburban community, was consistently praised as one of the strongest performances in a very strong ensemble cast. She won the Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Lead Actress in a Comedy Series for the role in 2005, and the Golden Globe Award as well, establishing her as one of the leading actresses of her television generation. Her film work demonstrated an even wider range. In 2005, she delivered what many critics consider her finest screen performance in Transamerica, playing Bree, a pre-operative transgender woman who discovers she has a son and embarks on a cross-country journey with him. The role required enormous preparation, research, and courage, and Huffman committed to it completely. The performance earned her the Academy Award nomination for Best Actress, the Golden Globe Award for Best Actress in a Motion Picture Drama, and widespread critical acclaim. It was a performance that demonstrated a depth and bravery of craft that went well beyond what her television work, impressive as it was, had fully revealed. Huffman is married to actor William H. Macy, with whom she has 2 daughters, and their partnership is regarded as one of the more genuine and enduring relationships in the entertainment industry. She has been candid in interviews about the challenges of balancing a serious career with family life and has spoken thoughtfully about the particular difficulties faced by women in the film and television industry. Jim Broadbent. Jim Broadbent was born on May 24, 1949, in Holton-cum-Beckering, Lincolnshire, England, into a family with creative roots. His father, Roy Broadbent, was a farmer and amateur actor, and his mother Doreen was an artist and sculptor, so the creative impulse was present in his household from his earliest years. He attended the London Academy of Music and Dramatic Art, one of Britain's foremost drama schools, and from there built a career in theatre, film, and television that became one of the most distinguished and beloved in British cultural life. Broadbent spent many years building his reputation in British theatre and in smaller film and television roles before the wider world truly caught up with how remarkable a performer he was. He was a founding member of the National Theatre of Brent, a deliberately small-scale theatre company that performed versions of epic historical and literary works with minimal cast and resources, and the work he did there spoke to a particular quality in him, a willingness to be ridiculous in the service of something genuine, an ability to find the deeply human inside the broadly comic. His film work throughout the 1980s and 1990s was extraordinary in its range and quality, even when the films themselves did not always receive the attention they deserved. He appeared in Mike Leigh's Life is Sweet, in The Crying Game, in Naked, in Bullets Over Broadway directed by Woody Allen, and in numerous other productions that demonstrated an actor who could disappear completely into a role and emerge as someone entirely different. He collaborated extensively and meaningfully with director Mike Leigh, whose process of developing characters through improvisation and deep personal exploration suited Broadbent's particular gifts perfectly. The role that brought him his highest international recognition came in 2001, when he played John Bailey in Iris, the biographical film about the novelist Iris Murdoch and her struggle with Alzheimer's disease. Broadbent played Bailey, Murdoch's devoted husband, across 2 time periods, and his portrayal of a man watching the woman he loves disappear gradually into cognitive decline was one of the most deeply moving performances of that year or any year. He won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor for the role, as well as the BAFTA Award and the Screen Actors Guild Award, and his acceptance speech was characteristically warm, funny, and modest. He subsequently appeared in Gangs of New York directed by Martin Scorsese, in the Harry Potter series as Professor Slughorn in Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince in Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, in Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, and in numerous other major productions that continued to demonstrate his extraordinary range. He appeared in Paddington 2, widely regarded as one of the best-reviewed films of 2017, playing the villain Phoenix Buchanan with an enormous comic relish that reminded audiences of how brilliantly funny he could be when given the opportunity. Throughout his career, Broadbent has maintained the essential quality that makes him so compelling to watch, which is a complete and unself-conscious humanity. He never seems to be performing. He always seems to simply be. That quality is the rarest and most valuable thing an actor can possess, and it has made Jim Broadbent one of the most treasured performers of his generation in Britain and far beyond it. Ted Levine. Ted Levine was born on May 29, 1957, in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania, and grew up in a household that did not have any particular connection to the entertainment world. He developed his interest in acting through school productions and community theater, and pursued the craft seriously enough to study it formally before beginning his professional career. He trained at the Goodman School of Drama in Chicago, which later became the theater school at DePaul University, and the rigorous classical training he received there gave him the technical grounding that would allow him to take on an extraordinary range of roles across his career. Levine worked in theater and in small screen roles through the early part of his career, building experience and skill without yet achieving the kind of recognition that would make him widely known. That changed decisively in 1991 when he was cast as Buffalo Bill, the serial killer antagonist in Jonathan Demme's The Silence of the Lambs. The film is one of the most acclaimed thrillers in cinema history, starring Jodie Foster and Anthony Hopkins in roles that won them both Academy Awards and became permanently embedded in popular culture. Levine's Buffalo Bill, a deeply disturbed and genuinely frightening creation, was in many ways the most difficult character in the film to make work, because he could easily have become a cartoon villain or an exploitative caricature. Instead, Levine made him something genuinely unsettling, a person of real psychological complexity whose horror came not just from what he did but from the recognizably human fragments visible beneath the monstrousness. It is a performance that has stayed with audiences for decades. Following The Silence of the Lambs, Levine worked consistently across film and television in a wide range of roles that demonstrated his refusal to be defined by any single type of character. He appeared in Heat, directed by Michael Mann, in American Gangster, directed by Ridley Scott, in Moby Dick and various other productions, and built a substantial and respected body of work across more than 3 decades of professional activity. He is perhaps best known to television audiences for his long-running role as Captain Leland Stottlemyre in the USA Network detective series Monk, which ran from 2002 to 2009. Stottlemyre is a character of considerable warmth and complexity, a police captain whose professional relationship with the obsessive-compulsive detective Adrian Monk is tested and deepened across 8 seasons of the show, and Levine brought a grounded decency to the role that made him one of the most beloved characters in a beloved series. The budget and how the money was used. The budget for Big Game was set at approximately €8.5 million, which converted to roughly $10 million at the time of production. This figure is critically important to understand because it places the film in a very unusual position in the world of cinema. On one hand, $10 million is a genuinely significant amount of money for a finished production. In fact, at the time of its making, Big Game was the most expensive finished film ever produced, a record that speaks to how ambitious the project was within the context of Finnish cinema history. On the other hand, when you compare that same $10 million figure against the budgets of the Hollywood action films that Big Game was clearly drawing inspiration from, the number becomes almost comically small. A standard mid-level Hollywood action film in 2013 and 2014 would typically cost anywhere between $80 million and $200 million. Big Game was attempting to do essentially the same thing: explosions, helicopters, Air Force One, an international star, wilderness action sequences, and a full orchestral score, on roughly 1/10 or even 1/20 of what those productions spent. Director Jalmari Helander and his team were therefore forced to be extraordinarily creative and disciplined about where every euro went. The decisions they made about how to allocate that limited budget tell you a great deal about what kind of filmmaker Helander is, and what he understood to be the true priorities of the story he was telling. Rather than spreading the money thin across every single element of the production and ending up with everything looking slightly underdone, Helander made deliberate choices about which things were worth spending real money on, and which things could be achieved through cleverness, location work, and practical filmmaking. A significant portion of the budget went directly toward securing Samuel L. Jackson for the lead role. Jackson is one of the most recognizable and bankable actors in the entire world, and his presence in the film was not merely an artistic choice but a commercial necessity. Without a name of Jackson's stature attached, Big Game would have had almost no chance of receiving international distribution or attracting the attention of audiences outside Finland. His fee would have consumed a very substantial slice of the total budget, which meant that everything else on the production had to be managed with genuine austerity. Another major portion of the budget went toward the practical sets and physical production elements that could not be faked. The most significant of these was the Air Force One set that was built in a studio in Germany. This set was constructed to represent the interior of the crashed and partially submerged presidential aircraft, and because the script called for extensive water work inside the set, with actors swimming through flooded corridors, dealing with rising water levels, and operating in genuinely challenging physical conditions, building and maintaining it was a complicated and expensive undertaking. Water and electricity together on a film set create enormous logistical and safety challenges, and the crew had to solve these challenges carefully to keep the production both safe and within budget. The outdoor filming, which makes up a large and visually spectacular portion of the movie, was handled in a way that was both economically savvy and slightly geographically dishonest. While the story is set in Finnish Lapland, the exterior mountain sequences were actually filmed in the Alps. The Alps provided exactly the kind of vast, majestic, snow-capped wilderness landscape that the story required, but they did so in a location that was logistically more accessible for a predominantly European production than the genuine remote forests of northern Finland would have been. Cinematographer Mika Orasma made extraordinary use of the alpine landscape, shooting wide sweeping vistas and intimate close-ups with equal skill, and the result is that the scenery in the film looks genuinely breathtaking in a way that punches far above the budget's weight class. Every frame is filled with enormous sky, rugged mountain terrain, thick forest, and the kind of natural grandeur that would have cost an American production an enormous amount of money to replicate artificially. The visual effects work in the film is where the budget limitations are most visible to a trained eye. Some of the CGI sequences, particularly those involving helicopters, large explosions, and the destruction of Air Force One, show the telltale signs of a production that simply did not have the funds to refine and polish every digital element to the level that a major studio picture would achieve. The blue screen work in certain scenes was noted by critics as being somewhat rough around the edges, and the digital compositing that blends actors with their backgrounds occasionally reveals its limitations in brighter or more controlled lighting conditions. However, and this is the key point, most audience members watching the film simply do not care. The energy, pace, and genuine entertainment value of the storytelling overrides the occasional visual shortcut, and the film is cut and staged in a way that minimizes the time the camera spends on anything that might expose the budget's boundaries. The decision to shoot the film primarily in Germany rather than in Finland itself was also driven largely by financial considerations. Germany offered various production incentives and infrastructure advantages that made it a more cost-effective base of operations for a co-production of this scale, and the involvement of German production companies in the financing structure reflected this practical reality. Bavaria Film Partners and Film House Germany were among the production companies involved, and their participation helped secure access to German studio facilities and the broader European film production infrastructure that made the movie technically feasible on its limited budget. The score, composed by brothers Yuri Seppa and Miska Seppa, was a genuine achievement within the budget constraints. The music is sweeping, orchestral, and genuinely cinematic, and it does an enormous amount of work in elevating the emotional and dramatic impact of scenes that might otherwise feel slightly underpowered. A good score can make a modest production feel twice its size, and the Seppa brothers delivered exactly that for Big Game. Critics who reviewed the film frequently singled out the music as one of its strongest elements, noting that it gave the adventure sequences a grandeur and propulsive energy that the visuals alone could not always achieve. The box office performance of the film ultimately demonstrated that the budget had not been entirely recovered theatrically. Big Game earned approximately $7.5 million worldwide against its $10 million budget, which means it did not recoup its full production costs through cinema ticket sales alone. However, this figure does not account for the substantial revenue generated through DVD and Blu-ray sales, digital rental and purchase, and streaming platform deals, all of which would have significantly improved the film's overall financial picture. The movie was made available digitally on the same day as its theatrical release in the United States, which was a deliberate strategy to maximize audience reach across all formats simultaneously, and this approach likely generated meaningful additional revenue beyond what the theatrical numbers alone suggest. Funny and entertaining moments on set. The behind-the-scenes story of Big Game is in many ways just as entertaining as the film itself, filled with genuinely funny moments, unexpected challenges, and the kind of warm human stories that emerge whenever a group of very different people from very different worlds are thrown together in remote mountain wilderness to make a movie. The most immediately funny element of the entire production was the simple fact of Samuel L. Jackson, one of the most intensely cool and physically commanding actors in Hollywood, spending his working days in a Finnish forest being bossed around by a 13-year-old boy. Ani Tamala, who was understandably nervous about meeting one of the biggest stars in the world for the first time, has spoken openly and with great amusement about how quickly that nervousness dissolved once they actually got into the forest and started working. He described how terrifying it was to meet Jackson initially, having grown up watching him in Star Wars and countless other films, and then how surprising and funny it was to discover that the reality of working with him was warm, easy, and genuinely enjoyable. The moment the cameras started rolling and Ani found himself giving orders to the President of the United States, the absurdity of the situation became something they both leaned into and found great humor in. Director Jalmari Helander has shared one of the most genuinely funny production anecdotes about Jackson's single creative demand for the entire film. When the fight choreography was being worked out for the action sequences, the stunt coordinator and various creative team members tried to give Jackson several impressive and cool combat moves to perform. After all, this was Samuel L. Jackson, an actor whose screen persona is built almost entirely on coolness and danger, and the instinct of everyone around him was to make his character look formidable even in a desperate situation. Jackson refused all of it. He insisted, with great conviction and apparent amusement, that the President should be completely unable to fight. He wanted to look, in his own words, like a girl who is trying to fight. His entire argument was rooted in a logic that was both funny and completely correct. How on earth would a president know how to fight? He has spent his career behind a desk, in conference rooms, and surrounded by people whose entire job is to make sure he never needs to defend himself physically. He has no training, no combat experience, and no instinct for violence. Jackson found this genuinely hilarious and insisted the performance reflect that truth completely. He wanted the President to be genuinely hapless in physical confrontations, and he committed to that helplessness with the same total conviction he brings to every role. The one exception to this rule, the one thing Jackson absolutely insisted must remain in the film, was that the President gets to kick the main villain in a very sensitive location. When the stunt coordinator and director were working through the fight sequences and discussing what the President could realistically do to a trained mercenary, Jackson made his single solitary demand with complete seriousness. He wanted to kick the bad guy in the groin. This one moment of deeply undignified self-defense was apparently non-negotiable for him, and the story of that demand being disclosed in interviews became one of the most widely repeated and enjoyed behind-the-scenes tidbits about the entire production. It perfectly captures the particular combination of humor and self-awareness that Jackson brought to the project. Ani Tamala's experience with his own physical preparation for the film produced another memorably funny story. In preparation for the wilderness scenes, Ani was given professional ATV training, a seemingly practical preparation for an action movie set in rugged mountain terrain. He described this training as genuinely exciting and enjoyable, spending several hours with professional ATV instructors learning to handle the vehicles in challenging outdoor conditions. He built up some skill and confidence over those hours of training. Then, when it came time to actually film the ATV scene for the movie, his total contribution on camera was to drive approximately 3 meters forward. All of the impressive and genuinely dangerous ATV driving in the film was performed by professional stunt drivers. Ani's hours of enthusiastic training prepared him for a role that lasted roughly as long as it takes to read this sentence. He recounted this with obvious amusement in interviews, accepting the gap between preparation and execution with great good humor. When asked about his stunt work more broadly, Ani was equally funny in his response. He admitted that he did essentially none of his own stunts because nobody on the production would allow him to, something he described with a mixture of slight disappointment and complete understanding. He did note that he had done some real archery work before filming, which meant that at least some of the bow and arrow sequences genuinely featured him rather than a double, but the more physically demanding and dangerous sequences were handled by professionals. The contrast between his preparation for the ATV driving and the reality of what ended up on screen became something of a running joke in his promotional interviews for the film. Jackson's relationship with the forest itself produced some quietly funny observations. Director Helander noted in interviews that Jackson handled the demanding outdoor shooting conditions with a remarkable and almost surreal ease. While other cast and crew members were dealing with the physical challenges of working in mountain terrain at various altitudes, dealing with unpredictable weather, cold temperatures, and the genuine physical demands of an outdoor shoot, Jackson appeared to simply treat the whole thing as a pleasant day out. Helander described him as just chilling out in the forest like he was in his own house, an image that is both hilarious and deeply characteristic of Jackson's apparently unshakable personal composure. The man who plays some of the most intense and high-pressure characters in cinema history wandered through the alpine wilderness between takes with the relaxed demeanor of someone enjoying a light afternoon walk. The weather presented its own unintentionally comic challenges for the production. Helander has spoken about the difficulties of shooting outdoors and mountain environments where conditions are entirely unpredictable and almost never cooperate with a shooting schedule. On one particularly memorable occasion, the crew found themselves facing the opposite of the problem they had anticipated. They needed to shoot the chronologically later scenes first, scenes that took place in heavy snow, and then shoot the earlier scenes afterward. This meant that when they arrived to film the final scene of the movie, it was covered in beautiful thick snow, exactly what they needed. But they then needed the snow to melt away so they could film the earlier parts of the story, and this was entirely outside anyone's control. Helander described the experience of watching and waiting and hoping for weather conditions to shift in the right direction while an expensive international cast and crews sat in the mountains waiting for nature to cooperate. Remarkably, the snow did melt away within about 3 days, which Helander described as a stroke of genuine luck. In the meantime, the situation of dozens of film professionals sitting on an alpine mountainside watching snow and willing it to melt must have had its genuinely absurd comedic qualities. The underwater Air Force One set built in the German studio presented its own category of challenging and amusing situations. Working in a large quantity of water alongside electrical equipment is an inherently dangerous and logistically nightmarish proposition, and the crew had to navigate an enormous number of practical problems to keep the shoot both safe and functional. Actors and crew members were working in water throughout the filming of those sequences, and the physical discomfort, the technical complications, and the sheer unpredictability of what happens when you put a film production in a tank of water all combined to create an environment where things regularly did not go according to plan. Helander described loving the set despite its complexity, which speaks to a directorial temperament that finds energy and creativity in chaos rather than being paralyzed by it. One of the most genuinely charming behind-the-scenes stories involves what Jackson taught Ani during their time working together. Between takes and during downtime on set, Jackson made a real effort to connect with Ani and to share some of his experience and knowledge with the young actor. Ani has said that watching Jackson work taught him a great deal about improvisation, about finding the spontaneous and unplanned moment within a scripted scene and trusting it enough to let it live on camera. This was a genuine and generous gift of knowledge from one of the most experienced screen actors in the world to a teenager making his way in the craft. Beyond the professional generosity, Jackson also taught Ani a special handshake, a piece of information that delights absolutely everyone who hears it, and that perfectly captures the warmth and playfulness that characterize their working relationship. The image of Samuel L. Jackson carefully teaching a 13-year-old Finnish boy a special handshake in the middle of the Alps while cameras and crew stood around them is one of the most endearing production stories to come out of any film that year. The PG-13 rating of the film produced its own category of on-set comedy. The film is quite violent in its action sequences, with numerous people being shot and various characters meeting rather dramatic ends. But the rating required that certain other elements be restrained, and the most famous example of this was the Samuel L. Jackson swearing situation. Jackson's entire screen persona is built in significant part on the extraordinary and creative force of his profanity, and audiences who love him expect and delight in this element of his performances. On Big Game, the PG-13 rating technically prohibited extended explicit language. The compromise the filmmakers arrived at was one of those solutions that is technically compliant with the rule, while also completely undermining the spirit of it. Jackson begins to deliver his profanity with full commitment, and then a gunshot cuts the word off at exactly the wrong moment. The result is that the film is simultaneously too violent for the swearing to seem out of place, and too family-friendly to let the swearing actually happen, a contradiction that critics found either hilarious or deeply frustrating depending on their perspective. The TIFF premiere of the film in September 2014 became its own memorable story. The movie screened in the Midnight Madness program at the Toronto International Film Festival, a section traditionally devoted to genre films and films with a strong entertainment value and audience-reactive quality. The screening became, by all accounts, one of the most genuinely electric screenings at the festival that year. The audience responded with extraordinary enthusiasm throughout, shouting and clapping during action sequences, laughing loudly at the comedy, and generally behaving in exactly the way a Midnight Madness audience is supposed to behave but does not always do. Helander described being moved to tears by the experience of seeing his film connect with an audience in that way, and Ani, who was seeing the completed film for the very first time that night having only glimpsed individual scenes during production, described his reaction simply as 10 out of 10. For a Finnish filmmaker and a teenage Finnish actor to stand in a Toronto cinema and watch an international audience lose their minds over their movie together is the kind of moment that makes the months of cold mountain filming and complicated water sets feel entirely worthwhile. The cultural and historical context of Big Game. Big Game is not simply an action film. It is a layered cultural document that carries within it the history of Finnish national identity, the deep traditions of Nordic wilderness culture, the global influence of American cinema, the political anxieties of the early 21st century, and the complex relationship between small nations and superpower dominance. To understand the film properly, you have to understand all of these things, because director Jalmari Helander did not make this film in a vacuum. He made it as a Finnish man who grew up watching American action movies and wondering why his own country, his own forests, his own people, could not exist at the center of a story like that. The result is a film that is simultaneously a loving tribute to Hollywood blockbuster culture and a quiet, intelligent commentary on that same culture from the outside looking in. Finnish national identity and the wilderness tradition. To understand the heart of Big Game, you must first understand what the wilderness means in Finnish culture, because it is not simply a backdrop or a setting. It is a living, breathing part of Finnish national identity that stretches back thousands of years and remains genuinely active in the daily lives and cultural consciousness of Finnish people today. Finland is one of the most heavily forested countries on Earth. Approximately 75% of Finland's total land area is covered by forest, and for most of Finnish history, Those forests were not merely scenery. They were the primary source of food, shelter, materials, and survival. The Finnish people developed their identity in direct relationship with that landscape, and the qualities most associated with Finnish national character, stoic endurance, quietness, self-reliance, connection to the natural world, and a deep comfort with solitude and silence, all emerged from thousands of years of living in intimate and often harsh relationship with a vast and demanding wilderness. Hunting in Finland is not a sport or a hobby in the way that many outside cultures might understand it. It is a deeply embedded cultural practice with roots that go back to the very origins of Finnish civilization. Archaeological evidence suggests that the ancestors of the Finnish people were hunter-gatherers inhabiting the forests and lakesides of the region for millennia before settled agriculture became dominant, and the skills, values, and spiritual relationship with the natural world that developed during that hunter-gatherer period never fully disappeared from Finnish culture even as society modernized and urbanized. Hunting remained a central activity in rural Finnish communities throughout the medieval period, through the Swedish and Russian imperial periods that shaped Finnish history, and into the modern era. Today Finland has one of the highest rates of active hunters per capita of any country in Europe, with the Finnish Hunters Association comprising over 150,000 members organized into more than 2,500 hunting clubs across the country. That number is not a fringe activity but a mainstream cultural institution. The tradition portrayed in Big Game, of a young boy going alone into the wilderness on a solo hunt as a rite of passage into manhood, is drawn directly from real Finnish and broader Nordic cultural traditions. Across Scandinavia and Finland, various forms of coming-of-age rituals connected to the wilderness, to hunting, and to the demonstration of self-sufficiency and courage in nature have existed in different forms across different communities for centuries. The specific ritual depicted in the film, where a 13-year-old must spend 24 hours alone in the forest armed only with a bow and arrow and return with a trophy, is a stylized and cinematic version of these real traditions rather than a documentary account of any single specific practice, but it is rooted in genuine cultural soil. The bow and arrow specifically is a significant choice. The bow is one of humanity's oldest weapons and tools, and in the context of a traditional wilderness culture, the ability to use one effectively represents a mastery of ancient skills that connects the user to their ancestors in a direct and physical way. For Oskari to be struggling with something as fundamental as drawing his bow is therefore not just a character detail. It is a statement about his relationship to his heritage and to the long chain of people who came before him. The landscape itself in Big Game carries historical and cultural weight. Finnish Lapland, where the story is set, is one of the most remote and sparsely inhabited regions of Europe. It is the territory of the Sami people, the indigenous inhabitants of the northernmost parts of Scandinavia and Finland, who developed one of the most sophisticated and deeply rooted relationships with the Arctic and subarctic wilderness in human history. The Sami culture is built around reindeer herding, fishing, and hunting, and their knowledge of the northern landscape is extraordinary in its depth and precision. By setting his story in this particular landscape, Helander is placing his characters within a tradition of human wilderness knowledge and survival that goes back not decades or centuries but millennia. Even if the film does not explicitly engage with Sami history and culture, the landscape itself carries all of that history within it, and the choice to set an adventure story there rather than in a more familiar or accessible environment is a deliberate act of cultural assertion. Sisu, the Finnish concept at the heart of the story. One of the most important cultural concepts embedded in Big Game is the Finnish idea of sisu, a word that exists in the Finnish language but has no direct equivalent in English or most other languages, which is itself significant. Sisu is most commonly translated as something like stoic determination, grit, inner resilience, or the ability to act with courage and tenacity beyond what one's physical or mental resources would seem to allow. The word is derived from the Finnish word for interior or guts, and in its deepest sense it describes something that cannot be learned or trained. It is an inner quality that reveals itself only when everything else has been exhausted, when the circumstances are impossible and the rational response would be to give up. Sisu is what makes a person continue when they have run out of reasons to continue. Sisu is considered so fundamental to Finnish national character that it is genuinely difficult to overstate its importance in Finnish cultural life. It emerged as a concept during periods of enormous historical difficulty for Finland, particularly during the Winter War of 1939 to 1940, when Finland defended itself against the Soviet invasion with a military force vastly inferior in numbers and equipment to the Red Army and managed to resist long enough to negotiate a peace settlement rather than being absorbed entirely. The Finnish performance in the Winter War became internationally famous, and was widely attributed to exactly the quality that Sisu describes: the refusal to accept defeat even when every rational calculation suggests that defeat is inevitable. The image of Finnish soldiers holding an impossible defensive line in freezing temperatures with limited supplies became one of the defining stories of Finnish national identity in the 20th century, and Sisu was the word used to explain how they did it. The story of Oskari in Big Game is, at its deepest level, a story about Sisu. The entire arc of his character moves from the absence of this quality to its discovery within himself. At the beginning of the film, Oskari is a boy who has not yet found his Sisu. He doubts himself, he cannot draw his bow, he does not believe he is capable of what is being asked of him. The discovery of the pre-killed deer in the refrigeration unit is the lowest point of this journey, the moment where all the support systems around him fall away and he is left with nothing but the choice of what to do next. His decision to leap onto the helicopter, to throw himself into the air to save the president, is his Sisu moment. It is the moment where the quality that had been hiding inside him all along finally breaks through the surface. It is not a rational decision. It is not a strategic calculation. It is pure, instinctive, burning refusal to accept the situation as it is. Helander has spoken in interviews about how important it was to him that the Finnish boy be the one who saves the day in the story, not because of special skills or superhuman ability, but because of this inner quality of refusing to give up. In a film whose entire premise depends on you believing that a 13-year-old with a bow and arrow can protect the President of the United States from trained mercenaries, the only thing that makes it work emotionally is the audience believing in the depth of the boy's determination. The cultural concept of Sisu, even if the word is never mentioned in the film, is the invisible architecture on which the whole story is built. The history of Finnish cinema, and Big Game's place in it. To understand why Big Game was such a significant cultural moment for Finland, you need to understand the history and particular character of Finnish cinema, which is one of the most distinctive and internationally underappreciated film traditions in the world. Finnish cinema has existed in various forms since the early 20th century. But for most of its history it was a deeply domestic industry making films primarily for Finnish audiences and rarely crossing international borders in any meaningful way. The films that defined classic Finnish cinema were often deeply rooted in Finnish literary and theatrical traditions, particularly in the epic national mythology of the Kalevala, which is Finland's national folk epic compiled in the 19th century and considered one of the cornerstones of Finnish cultural identity. The Kalevala is a vast collection of Finnish mythological poetry that tells stories of heroes, magic, creation, and the fundamental forces of the natural world, and its influence on Finnish art, literature, music, and film has been enormous and continuous. Finnish cinema in the mid-20th century was also characterized by a particular kind of realist drama, quiet, interior, deeply personal stories about ordinary Finnish people navigating difficult circumstances, that reflected the broader character of Finnish culture itself. These were not spectacular or internationally exportable films in the conventional sense, but they were genuine and powerful works that spoke directly to Finnish audiences about their own lives and experiences. The tradition of Finnish realism in cinema shares a certain spirit with the Scandinavian literary and cinematic realism that produced internationally celebrated work from Sweden and Denmark, and Finnish directors like Aki Kaurismäki, whose dry, deadpan comedies and tragedies attracted significant international attention from the 1980s onward, demonstrated that Finnish cinema could find global audiences when it trusted the specificity of its own cultural voice. Jalmari Helander's first film, Rare Exports, A Christmas Tale, released in 2010, represented a new kind of Finnish filmmaking that was neither the domestic realism of the older tradition nor a straightforward imitation of Hollywood genre cinema, but something genuinely in between. Rare Exports took a deeply Finnish subject, the mythology and tradition of Christmas in a Nordic context, and treated it through the lens of American genre cinema, specifically the kind of adventure and horror films that Helander and his generation had grown up watching. The film became an international cult hit and demonstrated that there was a global appetite for Finnish stories told with genre energy and international production values. Big Game was the direct continuation of that project, scaled up significantly in budget and ambition, and it represented the most expensive Finnish production in history at the time of its making. The significance of Big Game for Finnish cinema cannot be overstated. At €8.5 million, the film was a genuinely unprecedented financial commitment to the idea that Finland could produce internationally competitive commercial cinema. The decision to cast Samuel L. Jackson in the lead role was itself a statement, a declaration that a Finnish film could attract Hollywood star power and compete in the global marketplace on something approaching equal terms with American and British productions. The fact that the film was then received at the Toronto International Film Festival with enormous enthusiasm and sold to international distributors confirmed that the strategy had worked, at least artistically if not entirely financially. Helander has described Big Game explicitly as a love letter to the Hollywood action films of the 1980s and 1990s that shaped his childhood imagination, films like Cliffhanger, Die Hard 2, and Air Force One. He grew up in Finland watching these American blockbusters and absorbing their visual language, their narrative conventions, their particular brand of spectacular physical storytelling. When he came to make his own genre film, he brought all of that absorbed knowledge with him, while simultaneously insisting that the story be grounded in Finnish landscape, Finnish tradition, and a Finnish emotional sensibility. The result is a film that feels simultaneously familiar and foreign, which is exactly what makes it interesting. It speaks the language of Hollywood while carrying an accent that is unmistakably its own. The connection to the Finnish director Renny Harlin is also culturally significant. Harlin, who was born in Finland and became one of the major Hollywood action directors of the late 1980s and 1990s, directing films like Die Hard 2 and Cliffhanger, was the first Finnish filmmaker to successfully penetrate the Hollywood mainstream, and for many Finns of Helander's generation he was a powerful symbol of what was possible. The films that Helander grew up watching and that directly inspired Big Game were in some cases actually made by another Finn, creating a circular cultural connection between Finnish filmmaking ambition and Hollywood genre achievement that Big Game completes in its own way. The historical context of presidential vulnerability in American cinema. Big Game exists within a very specific and historically rooted tradition of American cinema, the presidential Jeopardy film, which is itself a product of particular historical moments and anxieties in American political and cultural life. To understand why the film's central premise works and what it means culturally, you need to understand the tradition it is drawing from and the historical context that tradition reflects. The idea of the American president as a vulnerable individual, stripped of power and forced to fight or survive without the protection of the world's most powerful security apparatus, has been a recurring fantasy in American popular culture since at least the Cold War era. Films like Air Force One in 1997, where Harrison Ford played a president who single-handedly fights off terrorists who have taken over his aircraft, and White House Down and Olympus Has Fallen, both released in 2013, where the White House itself is attacked and the president must be rescued, all tap into a deep anxiety about the fragility of American power and the vulnerability of its symbols. These films are paradoxically reassuring, because they always end with American power restored and American strength validated. But they would not exist if the anxiety they were addressing did not have real cultural depth. The historical context for this anxiety is significant. The assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963 was a foundational trauma for American culture that shattered the mythology of presidential invulnerability in a way that permanently changed the American imagination. The attacks of September 11, 2001, renewed and deepened these anxieties by demonstrating that the most powerful nation on earth could be struck at its symbolic heart in ways that its enormous military force was entirely unable to prevent. The years following 9/11 produced a wave of films, television series, and popular culture that processed and responded to these anxieties in various ways, and the presidential action film was one of the most direct expressions of this cultural need to imagine scenarios of extreme vulnerability followed by restoration of power. Big Game enters this tradition from outside, as a Finnish production looking at American presidential mythology with a perspective that is simultaneously admiring and gently satirical. The film takes the conventions of the presidential jeopardy genre and subjects them to a subtle but persistent comic deflation. President Moore is not the action hero president of Air Force One or White House Down. He is a man who cannot fight, cannot survive in the wilderness, cannot draw a bow, and cannot even make himself understood to the boy who is trying to help him. He is a powerful man rendered completely powerless, and the film finds this situation genuinely funny while also treating the underlying humanity of the man with real warmth. From a Finnish perspective, the most powerful man in the world is just a confused and helpless person in a forest, dependent on a local teenager who knows the land. This perspective carries genuine cultural and political weight. Finland is a small country with a population of approximately 5.5 million people, sitting geographically between the great powers of Western Europe and Russia, with a history deeply shaped by the pressures and interests of larger nations and empires. For most of its history, Finland was under the control of Sweden and then Russia, gaining independence only in 1917. The experience of being a small nation navigating the competing interests of enormous powers is deeply embedded in Finnish historical consciousness, and the image of the most powerful individual in the most powerful country on earth being completely dependent on a small Finnish boy to survive has a particular resonance from that perspective. It is not a hostile or anti-American image. It is something more nuanced than that. It is the view from a small, capable, dignified country that has always had to be resourceful and self-reliant precisely because the big powers around it could not always be counted on. From that perspective, of course it is a Finnish teenager who saves the president. Who else would it be? The political subtext and commentary. Beyond its surface entertainment, Big Game carries a layer of political commentary that critics and cultural analysts noticed and wrote about extensively at the time of its release. The commentary is never heavy-handed or preachy, because Helander is fundamentally interested in making an entertaining film rather than a political statement, but it is present throughout and adds a dimension to the film that rewards thinking about. The character of President Moore is deliberately constructed as a president whose authority and effectiveness are questioned by the people around him. At the beginning of the film, he is described as a lame duck president whose approval ratings are low and whose administration is characterized by the hawks in his government as insufficiently decisive and strong. He is criticized for lacking backbone, for being an intellectual rather than a fighter, for being passive when the moment demands action. This portrait of a black American president regarded by powerful interests within his own government as insufficiently aggressive and decisive was understood by many critics and audiences in 2015 as a clear reference to the political situation of President Barack Obama, who was at that time in the final years of his presidency, and faced exactly those kinds of criticisms from the more hawkish elements of American politics. Helander himself was somewhat cagey about this reading in interviews, acknowledging it without fully endorsing it, but the parallel is too specific and too sustained throughout the film to be entirely accidental. The conspiracy at the heart of the film, where the vice president and a former CIA operative have orchestrated the assassination attempt on the president in order to trigger a new war on terror, is a direct engagement with a specific historical and political anxiety that became widespread in Western culture following the September 11th attacks and the subsequent wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The question of who truly benefits from terrorism, and whether powerful interests within governments might have reasons to allow or even encourage attacks that could then be used to justify military action and the expansion of power, became one of the defining political debates of the early 21st century. By embedding this conspiracy theory logic at the center of a family action-adventure film, Helander is engaging with these real cultural anxieties in a form that is accessible and entertaining rather than earnest or confrontational. The character of Hazar, the mercenary who is revealed to have been a former CIA operative, carries its own historically rooted significance. The idea of intelligence operatives who began their careers working for Western governments and then went rogue, turning their knowledge and skills against the interests they once served, is not a fictional invention. It reflects a real and historically documented phenomenon that became particularly visible in the aftermath of the Cold War and the various proxy conflicts and covert operations of that era, where Western intelligence services trained, armed, and deployed operatives who subsequently became some of the most significant security threats of the following decades. Hazar's line near the end of the film, where he tells the president that he is actually on his side and that it is a long story, is a dark joke about the tangled and often morally compromised relationships between American power and the various forces it has employed around the world throughout the Cold War and post-Cold War periods. The coming-of-age story has historical and cultural universal. The coming-of-age ritual that forms the cultural spine of Big Game connects the film to one of the oldest and most universal categories of human cultural practice. Rites of passage, ceremonial and structured transitions from childhood to adulthood, from dependence to independence, from the protected interior of the community to the dangerous exterior of the wider world, exist in virtually every human culture that has ever been documented. They are among the oldest cultural practices of our species, and their near-universal presence across radically different societies and historical periods suggests that they meet a genuine and deep human psychological need. The specific form of rite of passage depicted in Big Game, the solo wilderness ordeal, is particularly historically resonant. Across many indigenous and traditional cultures worldwide, the practice of sending a young person alone into the wilderness for a period of time as part of a transition to adulthood has appeared in various forms. In certain Native American traditions, the vision quest involved extended periods of fasting and solitude in nature. In various African traditions, extended periods of separation from the community and exposure to physical and psychological challenges mark the passage to adult status. In ancient Greek culture, the agoge, the rigorous military and survival training of Spartan youth, included periods of deliberate deprivation and self-sufficiency testing. In Norse and Germanic traditions, young men were expected to demonstrate physical courage and skill in combat or hunting as markers of adult male status. The Finnish tradition depicted in Big Game draws from this deep well of universal human practice while giving it a specific Nordic and Finnish character. What makes this cultural context powerful within the film is the way Helander uses it not as mere exotic decoration but as the genuine emotional engine of the story. The question of whether Oskari will find the courage to complete his rite of passage is not separate from the action thriller plot. It is the same question. The wilderness ordeal and the encounter with the president and the mercenaries are not two different stories awkwardly stitched together. They are one story about whether a young person can discover within themselves the capacity for genuine courage when circumstances demand it. The president's own arc, his journey from helplessness to a moment of genuine decisive action when he kills Hazar, mirrors Oskari's arc in a way that suggests the coming-of-age ordeal is not only something that happens to children. Every person, at any age, faces moments where they must discover whether they have the inner resources the moment demands. The globalization of cinema and Big Game as international product. Big Game sits at a fascinating intersection in the history of global cinema, representing a moment when the traditional dominance of Hollywood was being challenged and complicated by the emergence of genuinely international co-productions that could compete with American productions in visual scale and entertainment value while maintaining distinct national and cultural identities. The film was produced by a consortium of companies from Finland, the United Kingdom, Germany, and the United States, distributed by different companies in different territories, and featured a cast drawn from Finland, the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, and Turkey. This international production structure was not unusual by the standards of European cinema in the early 21st century, but the ambition to make a genuinely commercially competitive international action film from this base was unusual. Most European co-productions aimed at art house audiences or festival circuits. Big Game was attempting something different. It was trying to take the international co-production model and use it to make a film that could compete directly with Hollywood genre productions in the mainstream commercial marketplace. The fact that it required a Hollywood star of Samuel L. Jackson's stature to make this viable is itself culturally significant. It speaks to the continuing extraordinary dominance of American star power in the global film market. Without Jackson, Big Game would have had no realistic prospect of international distribution or audience. With him, it could sell itself in every major market in the world. This dependency is a historical reality of the global film industry as it existed in 2013 and 2014. And it reflects the much broader cultural and economic dominance that American popular culture has exercised globally since the end of the Second World War. The irony of making a film about the dependency of the most powerful man in the world on the resources of a small Finnish community, while simultaneously depending on the world's most commercially powerful national cinema to make the film viable, is not lost on anyone paying attention. The tradition of the boy hero in Finnish and world literature. The character of Oskari belongs to a long and distinguished tradition of young male heroes in Finnish and world literature and mythology whose power comes not from physical strength or adult experience, but from a quality of inner character that adults around them have not recognized or valued. In the Kalevala, the great Finnish national epic, there are numerous characters whose heroism comes from unexpected sources and whose power is moral and spiritual rather than purely physical. The Kalevala is full of characters who are underestimated, who face impossible odds, and who succeed not through conventional strength but through cleverness, perseverance, and a connection to forces that more powerful and experienced individuals cannot access. In world literature more broadly, the archetype of the child hero who succeeds where adults have failed is ancient and deeply rooted. From David facing Goliath in the biblical tradition, to the young heroes of countless folk tales across every culture who use wit, courage, and goodness to overcome physically superior antagonists, the idea that true strength is an inner quality that can exist in the smallest and most overlooked person is one of the most fundamental and enduring stories the human imagination has produced. Big Game places itself consciously within this tradition, giving Oskari the particular challenge of succeeding not through magical powers or superhuman ability but through the kind of determined, frightened, and perfect courage that ordinary people can recognize in themselves. The specific detail of Oskari's relationship with his bow is historically and culturally resonant in this context. The bow and arrow is one of the oldest weapons in human history, appearing in archaeological records dating back tens of thousands of years and used across virtually every inhabited region of the earth. In Finnish tradition, archery has deep historical roots, both as a practical hunting tool and as a symbol of wilderness skill and self-sufficiency. The fact that Oskari cannot properly draw his bow at the beginning of the story represents not merely a personal inadequacy but a break in the connection between him and his ancestors, all of those generations of Finnish hunters who mastered this tool and used it to survive in the wilderness. When he finally draws the bow and releases the arrow that ultimately saves the president's life, he is not just completing a personal journey. He is reaching back through generations of Finnish history and finding within himself the connection to that long chain of people who came before him. Big Game as a document of its historical moment. Films are always historical documents as much as they are entertainment products, and Big Game is a particularly interesting document of the specific historical moment in which it was made. It was produced in 2013 and released internationally in 2015, a period defined by several overlapping cultural and political contexts that the film reflects and engages with. It was a period of significant anxiety about American power and its limits. The wars in Afghanistan and Iraq had demonstrated the constraints of military force in complex political situations, and the Obama presidency had been defined in part by the debate between those who wanted American power exercised more aggressively and those who believed in a more restrained and multilateral approach. The film's portrait of a president who is criticized for lacking toughness directly engages with this debate. It was also a period of intense global anxiety about terrorism and the security of the world's most powerful institutions. The post-9/11 era had produced an enormous cultural output processing the fear that the symbols and structures of Western power were more vulnerable than they appeared, and the film's central premise of Air Force One being shot down over Finland taps directly into this anxiety while treating it through the lens of adventure rather than tragedy. It was a moment when the global film industry was genuinely changing in ways that made a production like Big Game possible. The rise of international streaming platforms, the growing sophistication of European film production infrastructure, and the increasing willingness of Hollywood stars to work on international productions outside the traditional studio system all created conditions in which a Finnish director could make an internationally competitive action film with Hollywood talent and distribute it globally. And it was a moment in the history of Finnish cinema when the ambitions of a new generation of filmmakers were beginning to find expression in projects of genuine international scale. Helander's Big Game was the most ambitious expression of this generational ambition, and whether it fully achieved everything it set out to do or not, it demonstrated that Finnish cinema had arrived at a new level of international engagement that would continue to develop in the years that followed. If this deep dive into the cultural and historical world of Big Game gave you something to think about, please give this video a like and share it with anyone who loves cinema and the stories and histories behind the films they watch. We put serious work into every video on this channel, and every like and share genuinely helps us reach more people who care about this kind of content. Subscribe if you are not already with us, and hit the notification bell so you never miss what we put out next. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and we will see you in the next video.